Okay, so the last thing we need to talk about today are the ways that the Freudians would try and assess what was going on in your unconscious mind. These are the first sort of attempts at personality testing that exist. And some of them are still used today. So we're going to talk about two specific tests that are still in use today, although a little bit controversial. So as we've talked about, a good deal in the last couple of days, Freud believed that our personalities were completely motivated by these unconscious motives. And therefore, in his mind, in order to treat mental illness and to help cure people of whatever was wrong with them, he needed to figure out what was going on in the unconscious. And so he created a series of tests that he called projective tests. And projective tests are these open-ended exams that show you a variety of things. They're usually going to show you like vague images, or like the Rorschach inkblot test is probably the most famous projective test. So in that case, it's like literally just an inkblot. And he would ask you various questions to like describe what you saw or how it made you feel, or things of that nature, in order to like try and assess what was going on in your unconscious. He believed that like the story you would tell about a picture or what you saw in the inkblot were essentially like messages from your unconscious. And so he called them projective tests because of this idea that he thought he could get your unconscious mind to project thoughts into the conscious world through like these conversations, through like the free association of talking about an inkblot or a vague image. So projective tests, generally speaking, are standardized tests, which is kind of strange to think about because they are open-ended. They don't have like a set of answers. And they are categorized as having ambiguous prompts. And usually the two categories of our ambiguous prompts are going to be something along the lines of like the inkblot test, where it's literally nothing and I'm trying to get you to see something that's there, or like an image of something that, I'm going to ask you to tell a story about, and then I'm going to try to analyze the story. This, the most widely used of the projective tests is the Rorschach inkblot test, which was created by Hermann Rorschach, which is why it's named after him. And one misconception about the Rorschach test is that like you can use any inkblots for this test, but as I mentioned above, it is standardized. There is a set of 10 ink blocks that have been standard since the 1920s. And there's also like a certain set of expected answers. So, through, thousands at this point of interviews and tests with the Rorschach inkblots, we have been able to categorize the typical things that people tend to say. And then, psychoanalytic psychologists will then correlate those typical findings with, certain personality traits or mental health issues and things like that. So it's a little bit more scientific than it was during Freud's time. It's still not like the most empirical test in the entire world, but it is still used, right? The most important part of a Rorschach inkblot test is the verbatim note-taking. So the person giving the test is going to write down what you say exactly word for word. And that's super important because, a slight change of what adjective you choose to use might change the analysis of your answers. So I'm just going to show you an example of two different inkblots that are part of the set of 10 and kind of point out some of the things that are the expected answers so that you can kind of see what's going on. That being said, like I am not a psychometric psychologist. I say that all the time. So I don't know like what the expected answer correlates to in terms of your own mental health. I can just tell you like what are some of the images that you can expect to like hear people say. So here's a really famous one. You tend to get a couple of answers. A lot of people will say that they see a bug. So you see like the pincers here and kind of like this colorful back. You might have people say like a moth or a butterfly. There are some people who say that they see two bears. So if you see the bears, they're, here's the bear snout and head and ears. Then coming down, and here are his arms and his legs. and then you have the other bear facing the other way, doing the same thing. Some people will say that they see a mask, like a face mask. Definitely, having looked at this for the first time during the COVID pandemic, it kind of almost looks like, the face mask that we all are required to wear, except for you have these little holes in them, which would be very bad for a face mask. So those are some of the expected images. And then here is another one. Later on in the series, you get not just black ink blots, but colors as well. So again, it's very common for people to say spider or bug. And just looking at the big black kind of blob here, a lot of people will say they see a person in the middle. And a lot of times people will say they see a person like walking on a path towards the like sunset, sunrise. And that's one of those things where the verbatim note taking is super important, because if you say sunset or sunrise, that's going to give, the scorer a different kind of idea to analyze. A lot of people will say that they see some brain here, like that looks like a brain and that looks like a brain. Some people will say that they see like earbuds or, something related to music. Obviously, that's a little bit more recent of a finding as MP3 players and earbuds have become popular. But those are some of the common things here. So in terms of scoring a Rorschach test, you're going to get asked 3 questions if you take it. The first question you're going to get asked is, what do you see? And they will ask you, to say everything that you see. So it kind of looks like a bug, but it also could be this, but it also could be this. They aren't going to limit you to one response or seeing just one thing. The next question they're going to ask you is, where do you see it? They're going to ask you to point it out in the image and describe for them why you think you see that. And then the last question is, what makes it look that way? Is it the form? Is it the color? Is it the shading? And then based on all of those answers, they will analyze your responses and come up with a result for you. The other projective test that you see commonly used, or somewhat commonly used, is the thematic apperception test, the TAT. And this is a projective test in which people are given ambiguous images and they are asked to tell a story. So they're asked to describe what's happening to the people in the image that they're looking at. And then based on the story that they tell, obviously that's where we get the analysis. And all of the images are, again, standard, and also have a variety of different stories that you could tell. They're designed to be able to have happy stories or sad stories or weird stories. So here's one of the TAT images. It is, again, ambiguous enough that you don't know if you're looking at a boy or a girl. And the scorer is just going to ask you what is happening to this person in the image. Typically when we talk about this image in class, I'll get a lot of students that tell me that they look like they're passed out drunk or that they look like they're crying. Some students will kind of point to whatever this vague thing in the corner is. Some people think that it's keys. Other people say it kind of looks like scissors or a knife, and maybe this person is thinking of injuring themselves. Other people will say that this person is crying and maybe they just got dumped. Some people will take a little bit more innocent of a stance and say they're just looking for something under the couch. So again, just that vagueness that allows you to kind of tell your own story. And here is one more TAT image. This one, you clearly do have a man and a woman, but what's going on in the background is fairly vague. Some people think this looks like a woman in the background here as well. And so then the question becomes is this their house? Are they married? Did, she discover him cheating, or did he discover her cheating? Are they fighting? Is he trying to leave? Are they in a hospital? Maybe it's not their house at all. Just all of the different relationship dynamics that could potentially be going on there. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about here are some updates to Freud's ideas and then some criticisms. For the criticisms of Freud, I'm going to show you a SciShow video that goes through like what Freud's unconscious was versus what modern psychology thinks the unconscious is. And that's really like probably the biggest criticism of Freud is his misunderstanding of what the unconscious mind actually is. So you'll see at the bottom of page 8 in your note guide that you have those two like graphic organizer pieces with Freud's unconscious and the modern unconscious. So you want to take down some of those notes from the SciShow video. So in terms of updates to Freud, this is a lot. I would maybe pick a couple to write down. You will not need to memorize all of these. But, you know, the big one, I think, the one I would definitely write down is this first bullet point that we now believe that personality development is pretty lifelong. So that is in opposition to Freud's idea that your personality was set by the age of 6. That is certainly something we do not believe anymore, that all of your life experiences throughout your entire life can kind of shift your personality in small ways here and there. We now have a better understanding of the brain in order to identify that, you know, the infant neural networks, the way the brain works when you're super small, it doesn't work in the way that Freud kind of hypothesized, where, you know, we don't process memories the way an adult would, and therefore like an infant wouldn't be able to process trauma and like oral fixation the way Freud identified it, because their brain just isn't capable of doing that. Freud believed that your parents were like the main sort of pushing figure in your personality. We now believe that like peers, friendships, romantic relationships will have more influence on your personality in the long run. We definitely do not agree with Freud's idea that we can analyze dreams or slips of the tongue or anything to like uncover unconscious conflicts. And that definitely is going to lead into like what Freud thought the unconscious was versus what we know it to be now. The entire idea of repression is very controversial. I said that in our lecture on defense mechanisms. So our understanding of how we process trauma as adults has definitely changed. You know, and then finally, I've mentioned a couple times that Freud was very much a product of his time and therefore was really in the camp that like you can cure homosexuality. He was a very intense misogynist and like woman hater, and our understanding of like gender fluidity and sexual identity and all of that has shifted so drastically from the time of Freud that it really puts his theories in a much different light when you look at it through the lens of like our modern understanding of gender and sexuality and all of that stuff. Again, you have a relatively small space on page 8. I don't think you need to write down every single one of those, but I would pick a couple to make sure that you know. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to the SciShow video, and that will wrap up the screencast for today. And then we will be moving into the humanistic theories of personality.
This episode is brought to you by the Great Courses Plus. It's one of the most annoying comment memes out there. You are now breathing manually. You read that and suddenly your breathing starts to get distracting. Is it too fast? Too slow? Most of the time your breathing is unconscious, which is just easier. It happens on its own and you can focus on other things. But you can have your attention drawn to it and maybe control it a bit. Turns out that a lot of psychological processes are like that too. They're part of the unconscious mind. Anything that affects your thoughts, feelings, or behaviors without you being aware of it. That's different from the subconscious, a term that's generally used to mean things you're not currently aware of but could call to mind, like a memory. The unconscious is a lot harder to access because by definition, you don't know what's in there. But after decades of debate and research, most psychologists agree that it does exist. It's hard to even mention the unconscious mind without talking about one of the most famous bearded figures in psychology, the Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud. Freud wasn't the first to talk about the idea of an unconscious mind, but he got people around the world talking about it in a way they hadn't before. He thought the mind was made of 3 parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. The superego and id were kind of like the angel and devil sitting on your shoulder, whispering in your ears like in old cartoons. The id would whisper your selfish desires and was the source of your base biological urges, which, according to Freud, were often sexual desires. The superego was like your moral conscience. It focused on rules your parents gave you and society's expectations for how to behave. And the ego was you in the middle, weighing the influence of the id and superego and deciding what to do. According to Freud, the id and superego were mostly unconscious, so you didn't know they were influencing your choices or thoughts. It's like an iceberg. You can only see the small part that's floating on the top, but there's way more underneath that's holding it up. So how did the id and superego get down there? Well, according to Freud, it was through repression of painful childhood events. You push the memories to the back of your mind, to the unconscious. You didn't know they were there, but they could still influence your behaviors. There's just a small problem with this. We have no solid evidence that people repress memories that affect them this way. People forget things, of course, but they don't have memories they think they forgot lurking around in the back of their minds, waiting to be discovered. That doesn't mean the idea of the unconscious mind is wrong, though. Things can still affect your behavior without you being aware of it. Our understanding of the unconscious mind has evolved quite a bit since Freud, including a weird phase when scientists thought they could completely explain human behavior without a mind at all. But Freud had a key insight. People could behave in ways they didn't intend, or be influenced to act by things they're unaware of. We just no longer think of it like whole secret personalities stowed within us. You can find examples of unconscious processes all over psychology. One major field of study is priming, when people respond differently based on something that happened to them before. A surprising example of this was a study that asked people to identify some line drawings. The drawings were kind of broken up, so it was hard to tell what they were meant to be. Some subjects got to see the normal pictures beforehand, and another group didn't. Even though the group that got to see the images beforehand saw them 17 years earlier, they still did better at identifying the drawings. A bunch of people didn't remember that they were even part of the study that long ago, but they were still better at identifying the drawings. Somehow, seeing the drawings almost 2 decades earlier had affected their unconscious. There are lots of different types of priming, and it's worth mentioning that there have been a handful of priming studies that couldn't be reproduced, and even a few that were fraudulent. But this kind of memory priming has been a pretty reliable effect that's been studied for decades. And there are loads more processes that we know must be unconscious, like implicit biases, and the procedural memories that store information on how to do things like tie your shoes. Which means there was a big kernel of truth in Freud's theory. The unconscious mind must exist because experimenters can see the way things we're not aware of change our behavior. So we might not always know why we behave the way we do, or the real reasons behind our thoughts and feelings. There is a whole lot going on in your mind under the surface. This episode is brought to you by the Great Courses Plus, where you can get unlimited access to over 7,000 different video lectures taught by award-winning professors from the Ivy League and other top schools around the world about anything that interests you. Science, literature, even how to cook, or psychology, like this video from Professor Daniel N. Robinson.